It's natural that as the industry finds and settles on formulas that are proven to be successful, developers will begin falling back on design tropes while developing their games. And don't get us wrong, tropes aren't always a bad thing. But sometimes when they start becoming overused, or used improperly or inadequately, they can start bogging games down. We spoke a year ago about a few such tropes in single-player games that we are beginning to get tired of, and here we'll be listing out a few more of them. So without further ado, let's get started. Every game has loot. The looter genre, be it shooters or action RPGs, has caught on in popularity like nothing else this past generation. And we're really glad about that, because good looters can be some of the most addictive and enjoyable games out there. But not everything needs a loot mechanic, and no publisher needs that memo as badly as Ubisoft. Look at some of their more recent games: Assassin's Creed Odyssey, The Division 2, Ghost Recon Breakpoint. All of them had loot mechanics stuffed in. And while the likes of Odyssey and The Division 2 are great for that kind of stuff, by that same token, something like Breakpoint shows us that shoehorning loot into a game that doesn't need it can be disastrous. Everything is open world. Open world games are yet another genre that have really exploded in popularity over the past decade, which is excellent too, because they're the very definition of immersion and value for money. But do we really need every game to be open world? It seems like focused, scripted, guided experiences that end in about a dozen hours are now a dying breed, and that's a real shame. Just look at something like A Plague Tale: Innocence, a game that was completely linear, but delivered one of the best and most memorable experiences of 2019. We're all for huge, diverse, and compelling open worlds in games, but if that shoe doesn't fit, there's no need to force it on. Enemies with a death wish. How often do we play games and come across enemies that obviously stand next to huge red explosive barrels, as if they're stupidly waving their arms in the air and screaming, "Here, look at me, explode this barrel." Red explosive barrels themselves are a time-honored tradition in games, and no one really minds them. But do enemies have to be so thick-headed that they can't even stand a few paces away from them in the middle of a firefight? Losing all your abilities. For some reason, every so often we come across a game that figures it'll be a good idea to, mid-game, take away either all of your hard-earned abilities or at least your very best ones. We can see what those games are trying to do, challenging players to prove their skills with a crutch, and while that should be interesting, it rarely is. It usually is just annoying. Remember the part in Xenoblade Chronicles 2 where you don't have Pyra with you and Rex is forced to fight using crappy regular blades? Yeah, that wasn't fun. Stupid QTEs. It seems the gaming audiences at large despise QuickTime events, but they can actually be pretty cool when implemented properly, like in the older God of War titles. But sometimes, hell, most of the time, they're implemented very, very poorly. They're there for no reason, and not only do they not add anything meaningful to the game, they don't even make sense. Press F to pay respects? Who the hell thought that was a good idea? Squeezing through gaps. Two games come to mind when thinking of moments where a protagonist squeezes through a tight space in the walls to get to the next room. We certainly get that these moments exist for developers to work around hardware limitations, to act as a masked loading screen while the next room loads in. And they're certainly better than actual loading screens, but some games, like the two mentioned before, use these a bit too freely, and they eventually get repetitive and mildly annoying. Hopefully, with the advent of SSDs, developers won't need to employ such tricks in games on next-gen hardware. Forced vehicle sections. We obviously don't have a problem with all vehicle sections. When used properly, and when the vehicles themselves are fun to drive, these sections are excellent. But consider something like Batman Arkham Knight, and you'll understand why we have an issue with forced vehicle sections. When these sections take away the best parts of a game, and when they're not even fun, and in the case of Arkham Knight, when they manage to make something like the Batmobile boring, those are the ones we simply cannot stand. Ubisoft Towers. Ubisoft Towers have been a time-honored tradition in the open-world space for over a decade, and though they started out as an interesting mechanic, they have, by now, become so overused it's hard not to groan at the very thought of them. They're so overly structured, so mechanical, they seem to miss the very point of open-world design, complete freedom to do whatever you want. Thankfully, Ubisoft Towers are becoming something of a rarity now, and we're hoping the day that they're little more than a hazy memory isn't far away. Always online games that can be played solo. Multiplayer gaming continues to become more and more prominent with each passing year, but when developers start using multiplayer philosophies in games that can be played solo, it hurts a little bit. It makes sense why something like, say, Sea of Thieves needs to be always online. That's built into the game's core design as a shared world co-op title. But what about something like Ghost Recon Breakpoint? Yes, that game too is a co-op experience, but you can play it all by yourself if you want, and if you do, it's a completely solo experience. On the opposite side of that coin is something like Death Stranding, a game where multiplayer mechanics are crucial, but if you want to play it solo, you can do so completely offline. Why can't more games be like that? Timed missions. There are, to be fair, examples of games that pull off timed missions properly. The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, for instance, is built around timed missions, and it's fantastic. But games need to get a lot of things right to make sure timed missions aren't annoying. Because when these missions are combined with weird design choices, or a frustrating camera, or finicky controls, or a combination of any of those, they can also be an absolute nightmare. Big bads who are not boss fights. When we come across a major villain multiple times throughout the course of a game, we naturally begin looking forward to an epic boss battle against them later on. And the games where that doesn't happen can't help but disappoint us a little bit. How let down were all of us when we didn't have a massive fight against Harbinger in Mass Effect 3, or when there was no set-piece encounter against Skullface in Metal Gear Solid 5. Degradation mechanics. This one is a little contentious, because there are just as many people who love weapon and armor degradation mechanics as those that hate them. For the most part, we fall in the second camp. Checking in on your weapons every so often and making sure that they're not too damaged, fixing them, and worrying about finding replacements should they be beyond repair are all things that, most of the time, only end up getting in the way of the fun, not to mention the obligatory scrolling through menus to make the needful changes. Perhaps there will come a time when developers will find a way to implement degradation mechanics in a universally liked manner, but as of right now, that day seems very, very far away. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from Gaming Bolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.